Hey there guys, today we're going to be taking a look at Overwatch 2 running on the TRIGKEY Speed S5 mini PC and the AceMagician AM06 Pro. Now this is running with the Ryzen 5 5500U on the TRIGKEY here. So that is a 6-core 12-thread Zen 2 based APU with a Radeon 7 graphics chip. And in the AceMagician, we're pretty much rocking almost the identical setup in terms of RAM and in terms of the iGPU. The only difference is just the fact that now we're rocking a Ryzen 5 5600U. So now we get a bump from Zen 2 to Zen 3. So we do see a pretty noticeable IPC uplift in terms of the AceMagician here. But as you're going to find, it really does not make much of a difference at all in the vast majority of games out there. And even Overwatch 2, which I thought was going to be a far more CPU limited title here, was actually surprisingly GPU bound. Jumping into the actual game here, you can see that right now we're running the game at the native 1080p resolution. We're not using any upscaling. We're not using any dynamic resolution scaling, which dynamic resolution scaling is set by default. So in this case, we had to manually disable it, and it's just to get a more fair apples to apples comparison here. But overall, the level of performance that we actually end up getting in this does end up actually coming out in favor of the Ryzen 5 5600U. Now, one thing about the testing methodology here is that since the game doesn't have a built-in benchmark and you can't choose what maps you play on, we're just doing a 3-game average here. So the score that you see on the screen is after 3 different games and averaging out based off of the results that we got off of that. So after 3 games, both the 5600U and 5500U pretty much failed to deliver a 60 FPS average, and both of them weren't giving exactly the best 1% lows, but the 5500U was noticeably worse, specifically in terms of 1% lows. The averages were never really that far behind the 5600U. It's those 1% lows that really seem to struggle. Now, of course, the game does support FSR. When it first launched, it was FSR 1.0. At this point, it has been updated to include both FSR 1.0 and FSR 2.2, which is great to see. I hate it when games will end up replacing FSR 1.0 with 2.0 or any of its derivatives. The reason I dislike this is just because of the fact that FSR 2.0 actually does not impact the performance in the same way that FSR 2.2 does. So on low-end systems, that makes a big difference. And activating FSR 2.2 and setting the target render resolution to 67% pretty much ends up netting us some pretty massive gains here. What was surprising though is that the 5500U with FSR was actually consistently performing better. Specifically in the averages, 1% lows in general were usually around the same range. Again, this is after a 3-game average here. So after 3 different games, the 5500U did end up giving us better averages and better 1% lows. Not 100% sure what it is there. It could just as easily have to do with the different maps that were played. Of the 3 maps, only one of them pretty much was identical with another one in this specific run. So in general, the overall levels of performance that we're getting out of this are going to feel very similar, though the 5500U in this case is performing better. The AceMagician was not designed to run at this TDP. The AceMagician was designed to run at a TDP of 15 watts. I do have it configured to 25 watts. And you will see that the temperatures do get pretty high up there. That might actually be what's affecting the performance here. But if you look, the GPU clock speed is pretty much rock solid the entire time. And you'll see that the 5600U seems to consistently keep a higher CPU clock. But in general, this just translates relatively similar performance for the most part. In most games, you're really not going to find that much of a difference. But it is interesting to see, but it also shows you that with the 5600U, it all really just ends up depending on the specific system that you're getting. And of course, the fact that we have almost identical hardware, except for the CPU getting an architecture upgrade, pretty much means that in the vast majority of gaming cases, you're not really going to actually get much at all of an improvement unless it's a very CPU-bound game. And even very CPU-bound games tend to not exactly perform super well on these APUs, because even though they mostly rely on the CPU, the GPU still has to do something. And these Vega-based iGPUs are old enough that they kind of do end up dragging down the overall experience. So it is something to keep in mind there. But overall, I would really just say that the performance between the two is, for the most part, identical. Overall, the results here do show that on paper, the 5500U was performing better in this game. So very interesting results all around.